It's the quarter of an hour's now gone on to half an hour. There's gym time and there's other time, okay? Laurence, over to you.
Well, I feel rather like Daniel in the Den of Lions here. This is supposed to be question time. I noticed I didn't say question and answer time. Question time. Yes, Cullen.
At the risk of sounding like a complete plonker, this is the point of your actual class. Can I ask, what would you say to the many Christians that are in the Church of England who are very well-educated scientists as well as theologians, who accept Darwinism as a complete and satisfactory explanation for the origin of life, even though they also believe in a fine-tuned universe? Now, I know that's a scientific question that I put it to a theologian, hence I prefaced it with my bigger plonker, but can you shed any light on that at all? Because that's the question that troubles me quite a lot.
Well, I think that those who simply, I would say, accept Darwinism as the full answer to these matters, if you're asking the question about how would Genesis relate to that, obviously Genesis wouldn't relate to that, because one of the points I was trying to make was that Genesis wishes to retain the idea of God's initiation, and that creation climaxes with sanctification and holiness, and we're looking at something more than just the physical world. So the text itself, if you're just looking at the text of Genesis, would not accept Darwinism as a complete answer. There are obvious tensions between what I would take to be, say, just plain Darwinism or plain evolution, and the text of Genesis, but I would see those points of friction perhaps being in different places than many would. I mentioned that most ancient mythologies view creation as the result of struggle and battle. As such, those ancient mythologies have quite a bit in common with a basic theory of evolution, with its survival of the fittest and so forth in a competitive and combative world, and that explains everything. Genesis argues against that, and so I think you have certainly a very different perspective, because it may be one thing to say, well, we can understand, let us interpret the days of creation in such a way which makes it compatible with stages of evolution. But I'm less convinced at how you can not see that the process of evolution and the process of effortless creation are entirely compatible. So that's where I'd want to have a discussion with people in that particular camp, rather than the usual area of 7 literal days or billions of years. It's in a different category, I think. Yes, Jim.
We believe very strongly, as certainly I do, in the unchangeableness of God, the immutability of God. God was always a creator. In that context, can you expand your thinking on this concept of the beginning, in the beginning?
Right, that comes down to if we're dealing with Genesis 1, what is the first sentence of Genesis 1? That's been debated as well. Let me tell you how I see it. I see Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, as being a summary heading for everything that follows. In other words, dear reader, dear hearer, what is this chapter all about? It's about the fact that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The reason I want to stay with the text, apart from the fact that I'm a fairly boring biblical exegete, is that when it comes to deciding what does the Bible say, I find the best place to start is the text. Right? So it begins by stating, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then at the end of the seventh day, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So this account begins and ends with an almost identical statement. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Everything in between is about what? It's about the creation of the heavens and the earth in the beginning. So the bit about in the beginning is that the first verse is a summary of everything that follows. So to ask, I'm not sure if this was your question or part of your question, but this is sometimes how people ask it. What was God making before the first verse of Genesis? What Genesis says is that the physical universe is created by God. It doesn't. If God was doing something other than that, then we're not told, and we don't have access biblically to that answer. Now we might want to speculate, but that would be speculation. But it reminds me, I think it was St. Augustine, when somebody asked him the question, what was God doing before he created the heavens and the earth? And Augustine's answer was, he was creating hell for people who ask awkward questions.
There you go, Jim.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if I've actually answered your question though, so I don't. I'm trying to do justice to the question you're asking.
You have partly, Laurence. I just find it an enormously difficult concept. The idea of God having, we're understanding of God as He's from eternity to eternity. Mm-hmm. We understand that God is a creator. Therefore, God has always created. He didn't wake up one morning and thought, hey, I've got an idea I want to create. Therefore, right about the earth and perhaps this universe, it did have a beginning in actual fact. But I'm just trying to explore this characteristic of God about creation. And perhaps I'm veering into the idea of the multiverse concept.
Yes. That's something which isn't contrary to the text, but it isn't something that the text enters into, because the text is anthropocentric. It's human centered, and it gives us what humans need to know in that particular context. It doesn't deny the possibility of that, but it isn't something which it goes into.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Would you like to comment on the idea that there is a sort of double creation in the first verse of Genesis? First of all, there's a creation of matter, and then there's a totally different, separate part, where the separate parts of the universe were then created in the 6 days that follow. In other words, that there's a split between the initial creation of matter and yes, and then the second after that you have a completely separate creation of the bits of the earth that were done in the next six days.
Right. Well, I think it would come back. The answer to that is more complex. Okay, the question was, actually, rather than telling you what your question was, can you just ask Colin to repeat that briefly with a microphone, and then the rest of it?
Is what is called the building site theory, that in fact that God, in the beginning, all matter was produced, and that was that, and floating around in space and so on. And then you have a totally different account, which begins and goes on the 6 days. It actually remolds the matter.
Right. Some of you will have Bibles in which the first verse of Genesis is not a separate sentence. What I had on the screen, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, right? But some of you will have versions like this one, actually, which begins, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless picture, which is rather different. I think a quick answer to your question, Colin, would be this, that I would take the first verse of Genesis to be a separate sentence, and it summarises everything that follows. So there isn't a temporal gap between verse 1 and verse 2. It's simply, the first verse is, dear reader, what is this chapter all about? It's about the fact that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's the title. The opening words are, now the earth was without form and void. So that's the first thing we hear. So the question, for how long has it been tohu and bohu? For how long has it been without form and void? It doesn't enter into that. It could have been there, for a split second, or it could have been there for, well, you name how long. So the idea that you've got material there at the very beginning, I think, is certainly supported by the text. Now, some of us may, statements of Ellen White that God was not indebted to pre-existing matter and so on. Well, I don't think he's indebted to pre-existing matter, and it isn't that the matter that God uses is somebody else's matter. He just stumbles across it and starts using it. It's all his, so he's not indebted to pre-existing matter. But it's self-evident that in other parts of the creation account, God does use what's already there. So God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He didn't say, let there be man, and there was man, you see. So the idea that creation is more than bringing into existence that which does not exist. It is also separating and assigning functions. So in light of what you were saying, I think that that's certainly supported by the text. By the time we get to the beginning of the creation account, which is verse 2, there's something already there. Beyond that, prior to that, the text doesn't give us any access to that.
I understood what you were saying about the dual, let us make man in our own image.
Yes.
But does what you say preclude the possibility that it's actually talking about Trinity? Because I was told many years ago when I became an Adventist, this was a theory, that it's actually in the Old Testament there are evidences of the Trinity. So what you're saying, does it preclude that possibility?
Well, you remember when I said the plural, I don't think there is an absolutely cast iron explanation for the plural. So the problem is that when I say I don't think the plural is evidence of the Trinity, then quick as a flash people say, so you don't believe in the Trinity then? No, I didn't say that. I've just said this verse is, I think, less likely. Now, it doesn't preclude it. It isn't an impossibility. But I think it less likely that this particular verse is presenting the Trinity. I think that's something we need to, that the relationship within the Godhead is something which becomes clearer once we get to the New Testament. And the Old Testament, okay, it may have hints of it, but those would only be hints from hindsight, I think, rather than looking forward.
Dr. Laurence, please answer the question for my 13-year-old daughter. So this is a question for her.
Right.
Where would you put the dinosaurs and Neanderthal man and all the mammoth and all those things in terms of verse 1 versus the rest of the first chapter of Genesis? Can you contextualize where those may fit from a theological point of view?
they would fit in chapter 1, verse 21, or at least it partly fit there. God created the great sea monsters, the Tanaim. This is a general word for monstrous beasts. Now, of course, Genesis 1 doesn't list all species, genera, and so on. But what it's saying is that whatever there was is created by God. So there's this statement, the recurring point in Genesis 1, where it talks about after their kind, at least in the King James Version. God created these things after their kind. Now, that's sometimes taken to mean fixity of species. You know, he created them and they can only reproduce after their kind. That isn't the meaning. After their kind is simply a Hebrew way of saying all varieties of. So he created these creatures after their kind, those creatures after their kind, all varieties of that particular group. So if they're anywhere, that's where they are. But Genesis isn't interested in naming them or expanding on them. But it talks about the great sea monsters, the Tanaim, which are more than just the normal things that you see swimming.
You mentioned earlier that Genesis was written within the culture of the time. It obviously wasn't answering scientific questions. That wasn't the reason for Genesis. So can you tell us what it was that it was written for?
The people at the time of Genesis are living in a particular world where people are asking certain questions. We're living in a world in which people are asking certain questions. So Genesis wasn't written primarily to address the questions of our time, because that would have eliminated the questions that people had, at any other time. So like any other part of the Bible, it's addressing the questions of its time. So in the book of Genesis is the product of the Hebrew mind, the Semitic mind, and the Hebrew mind expresses itself about matters of first importance through narrative. So if you're in ancient Israel, you tap on somebody's shoulder and you say to them, "My dear sir, my dear madam, can you tell me what is the meaning of life?" That person would turn to you and say, "Let me tell you a story." Now in Genesis, we have Genesis 1, and then we have Genesis, believe it or not, Genesis 2. Okay, Genesis 2 and 3. They're rather different stories, because creation is so important that Genesis says, if you want to know this about God, let me tell you a story. If you want to know something else about God, let me tell you a story, which is Genesis 2, which isn't the same kind of story, a bit like the four Gospels. We have four stories about Jesus. Each of them gives a different perspective. So the first chapter of Genesis presents God as transcendent, who speaks everything into existence, and does so in a way which counters the mythological views of its time. Chapter 2 presents a God who is immanent, who is close. He's on his knees, forming man from the dust of the ground, breathing into his nostrils the breath of life. Breathing into the nostrils the breath of life. This is a Hebrew way almost of saying giving somebody a kiss. The last time any of us experienced somebody else's breath in our nostrils, we were probably kissing them. It's an intimate kiss of life. So a Greek would say, look, come on, I can't get my head around this. I need to synthesize that God is transcendent and he's immanent. Now the Hebrews do it a different way. They tell two stories. You want to know how God is transcendent? Let me tell you this story. But if you want to know how God is immanent, I need to tell you a second story. He's both this and he's that. And in doing both of those things, they're presenting a biblical view which is not in line with the thinking of their time. So it's a polemic against the commonly accepted view of the time. It's like in our own age, people will say to us, but it's self-evident. Well, it's only self-evident to those for whom it is evident. And Genesis is countering what people think is self-evident at the time.
This is Anthea's question. Anthea wants to know in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4a, what it means when it says these are the generations. What does generations mean there?
I'm trying to read what it says in your book, but I can't quite understand it.
I had actually considered speaking on this matter, but I thought if I told Jim to tell you all that you'd have a speaker who would deal with the biblical genealogies, none of you would turn up, you see. If you were to ask me what is Genesis 1 as a piece of literature, then it is a genealogy. Now, why do I say it's a genealogy? Well, because of what Erica just read there. You read the account, and the last line is, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Now, I can't answer this ultra briefly, but if I can illustrate it. The first chapter of Genesis, we have 6 days, and then we conclude with the 7th day, and the 7th day is the climax of the account. That's how God brings the world into existence. So that's the genealogy of the heavens and the earth. After that, we get the genealogies of human beings. So what you find in the genealogies of human beings is you find the same fingerprint of God in human history as you did in creation. So the end of chapter 4 is our next genealogy. It brings us down to Lamech. Lamech is the 7th from Adam. And he makes a speech to his 2 wives, so you can see how history is going. Makes a speech to his 2 wives saying, Zeddah and Zillah, hear my voice. And in part of that, he says, if Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So can I just review that very quickly? The first generation of the heavens and the earth, we have 6 days culminating in the 7th, which is the climax. The next generation is of human beings. We come to Lamech, who is the 7th from Adam, and he makes a speech about 7 and 77. Lamech, the next chapter is chapter 5. In that genealogy we have another Lamech. He happens to die aged 777. In that next genealogy, the 7th person mentioned in the genealogy is Enoch. And he's the odd one out. He's the only one who doesn't die. And as you go through all the genealogies in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's the 7th, the element of the 7th, which is emphasized. So, very briefly, creation of the heavens and the earth is a genealogy. God brings these generations of the earth into existence. And the same pattern that you see in the creation of the heavens and the earth, you see in human history. That is to say, the same God who brought into existence the heavens and the earth is guiding human history. It isn't open-ended, it isn't an accident. It's got structure and purpose to it. I may have lost some of you in that, but it's a Hebrew way of expressing God in control.
It's just that generations could be taken by people to think that creation was over many, many centuries, not 7 days.
No, not in itself.
That term, generation.
Yes. The term generation, the Hebrew word is toledoth, and it just means generations or genealogies, and it's the same word which is used in all of the other human genealogies as well. In and of itself, it doesn't carry the idea that we're dealing with long eons of time. In itself, it doesn't mean that.
Coming back to us, is the same us of 126 and 11:7, is that same us also of 3:22? Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. Is that the same, or are we possibly talking then?
The grammatical construction is different, but it's nevertheless still a plural. So it's in terms of the plural of deliberation, it would be a different idiom. but it is the use of the plural nonetheless. So I'm not sure that that would underline the significance. I think this plural deliberation I was talking about is a plural form of a verb. You know, let us do this, let us do the other. Whereas this is, man has now become like one of us. I will admit I'm not sure what the meaning of 322 is. Not because of the use of the plural, but just in general. Haven't quite...
And one other, very quickly. You refer to the Sabbath as being the ultimate, and in your presentation, man is important, but time, Sabbath. Now in Mark 2:27 we read, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath.
Yes.
So I appreciate if we're looking at Genesis, I accept that, but if we're looking at the Bible as a whole, do we not then get a slightly different perspective where Sabbath and man come into play?
It's a good question you ask. I mean, the statement in Mark is addressed by Jesus to people who have made the Sabbath absolute, almost in isolation from the its blessing to human beings. So in Genesis, the two are put together. That is to say, the Sabbath is there not as an ultimate thing to which everybody bows their knee, but it's to point out to these creatures who have been created that there is more to life than just the physical which surrounds it. It involves relationship with God, holiness and sanctification. So what Jesus is talking about is how that as an opportunity, as a concept, has been ruined by well-intentioned legalism. So I see the two as being not in conflict, but they're looking at it from a slightly different point of view, but they're not in conflict, I don't believe.
Tell me why the seventh day has no boundaries in Genesis. Why doesn't it say there was an evening and a morning? There was a seventh
Yes,
day?
okay. That's a good question, and this is something which is often asked. Now, if you look at the first 6 days of creation, days 1 to 6, they all have the same structure. Well, that is to say, they all have 5 elements in common. They all have, and God said, let there be, and it was so, and God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, a first day, second day, third day. That is almost absolute. The one exception to that is the second day, and on the second day it doesn't say God saw that it was good. Some have suggested, of course, that the second day of the week, being Monday, even God doesn't like Mondays. So, but once you get into the rhythm of the first 6 days, and God said, let it be, and it was so, and there was he saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, and God said, let there be, and it was so, God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was a morning. You know what's coming next. You know, you're on this rhythm. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now the point you make about there not being, there's no evening and morning, the 7th day, is true, but none of the other elements are there either. Everything which distinguishes the other preceding 6 days, not one of those elements is present on the 7th day. And God sanctifies the 7th day. He made it holy. And the basic meaning of holy is that which is set apart. So, again, typical Hebrew way of telling a story or a narrative or whatever is to use repetition, but when you get to the most significant point, you break the pattern in order to say this is the most significant. That's what happens here. The 7th day breaks the pattern. So it isn't just, it won't do for people to say, well, because it doesn't say there was evening and there was morning, a 7th day, then we're still in the 7th day. That is to impose on it an alien set of, values. The 7th day shares nothing in common with the preceding 6 days, because it is totally separate from the other days. It is holy time, and the first 6 aren't.
I'm just curious to know, thank you very much, by the way, for this presentation. It's been very stimulating. What you make of the idea that God actually created time and space. There's a sense in which, if we take the idea that beginning in the beginning is absolute, as in the beginning of all beginnings, then a question which I see that may come up would be, what about the very biblical narrative that tells us what happened, with regards to Lucifer in heaven and the fall? What are we talking about, and how does all that work? So because we know that things are going on other than in the process of creation, but again the text doesn't tell us. So without wanting to make this complicated in those kinds of ways, from what you've understood, reflecting on the beginnings, from the point of view of text, given that our own church has some people who think that the, shall we say, Renaissance type formulations of time being created by God and God being transcended above time, versus those Adventist theologians who believe that time, God works within temporal time and only within temporal time. What would you say on that particular matter?
Well, I think that Genesis, looking at Genesis, is deceptively simple in that it doesn't enter into some of these some of these areas. It's got one particular thing to tell us, and it tells us that, and it doesn't tell us the other things. So those things are going to be more speculative. So you're talking about, well, what's going on in heaven and what preceded, and does God's existence, precede that of the activity in Genesis 1 and all that sort of thing. That is all something that we assume, but it isn't something that Genesis is interested in. So from an exegetical point of view, in a sense, there isn't an answer. It's more a question for philosophers and systematic theologians, which is why we sit in different offices at Newbold. So I'm not trying to avoid your question at all. It's just that there's a danger of trying to extract from the text matters which are very interesting, but which the text themselves doesn't actually address, and I think that's one of them.
I might be in danger of sounding like a 16-year-old here. Is it possible that God could have gone on creating after the creation week? I ask this because I was recently giving a little talk on about how God had created the camel. And somebody who, like you, will probably go to hell, said to me, well, at creation, there was no deserts. So why would he have created the camel? And so I'm just asking, is it possible that God went on creating as he saw the need? Or was everything literally complete in the first week?
I think Genesis as a kind of a simpler scope. Again, it doesn't address that question directly. So it would be in keeping with the view of Genesis. The view of Genesis is that whatever you see, God was responsible for it. You look around. This is an account of how things were in the beginning. So it doesn't address the particular question that you're asking, but it would lay the foundation for the view that whatever there is, God is responsible for it, and in his free will he could do it. So it would leave open the possibility, the freedom for God to do it, but it doesn't address the question directly. So it's not against, but it's separate from and silent about that.
As we know fairly well, this business of the Sabbath and creation is quite a hot topic at the highest level in our denomination at the moment. Are we running up the wrong path if we try to make our Sabbath doctrine fully reliant on the 6 literal days of creation? In other words, does the Sabbath doctrine have other foundations in Scripture other than the book of Genesis?
Let me give a personal testimony to begin with. I studied at Newbold with Jim, or at least we were both at Newbold together. And Then I went to Andrews University. And in both places I had classes on Genesis and the creation account. A little later I did a degree at Princeton, which was originally a Presbyterian foundation, and I did a course with somebody who was a Methodist, well-known biblical scholar, president of the Society of Biblical Literature. And I did a whole semester with him on Genesis 1 to 11. It was about halfway through doing that class with him. I remember getting up one morning and thinking of Genesis and saying to myself, at last I think I understand it. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that one thing was absolutely clear to me from Newbold and Andrews. It was 7 literal days. You've got that, you've got everything you need. You don't have everything you need. Because the theological purpose of Genesis needs to be understood, and it's the theological purpose which gives the foundation for true, insightful Sabbath observance. I'm not saying the other is irrelevant, but as I was saying to somebody else, I don't wake up in the morning and say to my wife, we were married on the 8th of August. I don't wake up in the morning and say to my wife, what day was it we were married? 8th of August, wasn't it? Was that a Monday? Or was it Monday? Right. Now, the next morning I don't wake up and ask the same question, because our marriage is more than knowing the day of the week and the date on which we were married, if you follow it. So with the Sabbath, the literalness or otherwise of the days of creation has some purpose, but you can establish that and still be a Sunday keeper. It's what is the significance of that? Now, what I tried to do in the presentation was to show the significance that this text would have at its time, and I think some of the implications, for ourselves. Now, is there within Scripture more justification for Sabbath observance than just the creation account? Well, we have the Ten Commandments. We have the example of Christ. We have in Deuteronomy chapter 5 gives us another version of the Ten Commandments. And the most striking difference between the Ten Commandments we find in Exodus 20 and those we find in Deuteronomy 5 is that in the 4th commandment, the motivation for keeping Sabbath says nothing about creation. Observe the 7th day. 6 days you shall work and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath unto the Lord your God. For you shall remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and with getting to the word God brought you out. So the motivation for Sabbath observance in Deuteronomy is redemption, not creation. Now, if God can give us a version of the Ten Commandments in which the motivation for Sabbath observance doesn't even mention creation, we need to be careful that we don't put all of our eggs in one basket, saying that if you take away this, then the Sabbath goes, because Deuteronomy doesn't even mention creation, but it does mention redemption. So the Sabbath is multifaceted, that's what I'm really trying to say. So certainly creation and Genesis enrich our understanding of the Sabbath, but it's not the only leg on which the Sabbath doctrine stands.
You did mention about us being created in God's image, that it meant we are representatives of God. I wanted to know if the text implies that we are the only beings created in God's image, or if there's room to think that there could be other beings created in God's image, beings representing someone else.
In the Genesis text, the only beings created which are in the image of God are human beings. Now, I said that people have lots of ideas about what it is, but the answer I'm going to give, I think, relates to your question about any other part of creation which is in the image of God. I think that this question of what does the image of God mean is a wonderful thing that philosophers and systematic theologians spend their entire lives polishing. But I think the text gives us a straightforward answer. In verse 26, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." I think the second half of the verse provides the answer to the first half. That is, let us make humankind in our image. What is that? Well, it means to have dominion over the rest of creation. So that's why human beings are the only ones in the image of God, because we are God's representatives and we exercise God's beneficent and gracious rulership over his creation. That's what it means to be in the image of God. So it's only human beings who are in the image of God, but they are morally responsible for how they exercise that dominion.
Laurence, would you like to expand on that a little bit? The way that God exercises dominion over us, should we replicate the same pattern over plants and animals? Would you go so far as to suggest that maybe the book of Genesis is a kind of champion for animal rights? You know, the way we treat animals. You mentioned earlier that we are made almost in the same way, in the same context. Is there something there that is worth exploring?
Yes, I think so. I think it's also a spin-off from the point I was trying to make earlier, that we are not the climax of creation. We are part of a larger web, and on day 6, the text wants to make quite clear that we have a lot in common with the animals. Now, there's something which distinguishes us. We are in the image of God. But rather than ecological issues being a distraction from our main mission as Christians, I think that we have responsibility to exercise authority in God's world in a way in which God would want us to do so. So there's an ethical responsibility in acting out the image of God.
Laurence, it's 5 o'clock. I think we'll bring it to an end there. Again, let's show our appreciation. That says a lot. Before I can get my words out, they're inclined to clap me, so well done. Actually, you've really added to the experience here, certainly. I think you've got us intellectually thinking, and that was part of the objective of this weekend, and you've more than fulfilled that, and we are ever so appreciative. Come back to ASI again, even it's only to relax with these good folks here. We have I think a good social get together.